Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. Today we are going to talk about repeating code. And I know that that sounds a little boring, but rest assured it's not. It's not us typing code and then copying and pasting as many times as we need to. Instead, we are going to look at what are called loops that allow us to repeat code based upon a condition. As long as the condition is true, then the loop will continue to repeat the same code over and over again. And loops are very useful whenever dealing with large amounts of data. If we need to process that data, especially if it's within an array, then loops make that really easy to do. So some of the examples that we will look at today will incorporate the use of arrays in conjunction with a loop. Now, the JavaScript language gives us several loops. We are going to look at 3 today. And these loops aren't really unique to JavaScript. Most other programming languages have the same 3 loops. The syntax might be a little bit different, but for the most part, the ideas and the functionality is the same. We'll start with a for loop. And this is FOR. It's not FOUR or the number 4. It's just the word FOR, for. And the idea of the for loop is to execute code for a certain amount of iterations. Now, the term iteration is basically the same thing as repetition. So if we have a loop that is going to go through 10 repetitions, we would say that it has 10 iterations. So that's just terminology for loops. Okay, so the for loop, we begin with the for keyword, and then we have an opening parenthesis, and then we need to specify a counter because the for loop primarily uses a counter to keep track of the iterations that we go through. And we do so by just creating a variable. You can call this variable whatever you want to. The tradition is to use the variable name of I. You don't have to name your variable I. In fact, I personally use I because this is rather unique. If you need to search for a variable called I, then that's easily found. As opposed to searching for something that has I in it, you're going to find many hits. So traditionally we use the variable I, but you can use whatever you want. And we need to initialize it with a value. Now, we typically start at 0 because, as I've said before, we start counting at 0. And especially if we are going to process an array, which the for loop is very good at doing, then we want to start at 0. So I'm going to initialize this at 0. And this portion of the for loop is called the iteration. We actually have 3 things that we need to set up for a for loop, and the initialization is one of those things. The second thing we need to set up is the condition. The condition determines when we iterate the loop and when we exit the loop. As long as the condition is true, then we will iterate. And then whenever the condition is false, then we will exit the loop. So let's say that we want to perform this loop for 10 iterations. We would do so by using a condition of I is less than 10, because remember we are starting at 0, so the 10th iteration will actually be the value of 9. And so whenever we get to the value of 10 for our counter, then the loop is going to exit. So we only iterate for 10 iterations. Okay, so we have the initialization, and then we have the condition. The last thing we need is the incrementation, and this will increment the counter variable. We can also increment other things if we wanted to, but for each iteration of the for loop, the incrementation portion is going to execute. So we want to modify the value of I by 1. Well, usually by 1. We can modify it by anything. We can use multiplication, we can add a 2 to our counter, but since we want to go from 0 to 9, basically, we will just modify that by saying I equals I plus 1. And then we close the parentheses, and then we have a pair of curly braces. And then anything in between the curly braces are going to execute as part of this loop. So let's use an alert statement, and let's alert the value of I, because I is going to change for every iteration. So let's open this in the browser, and we are going to have to click this 10 times, but we start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then this is the last iteration because this is the 10th iteration. We do not get another alert box. Most of the time, however, you're not going to actually specify the ending value for your counter. I just picked the number 10 to show you how the for loop works. But if you're using a for loop, chances are you're doing so to process an array. So first, let's add an array. And I'm going to call this names, and let's give it some values. Jeremy, Jeffrey, Jennifer, and Jackie. So we have 4 elements in this array, and we need to modify our loop to iterate for as many elements in the names array that we have. So to do that, we simply use the names.length property. This is going to return the value of 4, so we are only going to iterate 4 times. And then inside of our for loop, we can use the I variable as the index value for the names array. So let's create a variable called name, and we'll do names of I. And then this is going to get whatever element we specify, because I is changing for every incrementation of the array, and then we can simply alert name. So let's go back to the browser. We have Jeremy, Jeffrey, Jennifer, and Jackie. So this is how we use arrays in conjunction, especially with a for loop. But if you are using a for loop to process an array, you need to do your condition a little differently. Because for every iteration, the length property has to be evaluated. So it has to go and count each element for every iteration of the loop, and that's a little inefficient. Since we only have 4 elements in this example, that's not really a big deal, but if we have an array with 100 elements or 200 elements, that could begin to add up. So instead of using the length property in our condition, we can actually create a variable inside of our loop initialization portion. We can call this len, short for length, or we can also use the variable L. Either variable is considered tradition. I use len because it's a little bit more explicit as to what this is. So var I equals 0, comma, then len equals names.length, and then we change our condition to be I is less than len. So what this does is this gets the length property and assigns that to a variable. So we no longer have to evaluate the amount of elements within the array. That's already been done once and assigned to the length, to the len variable. And then we use that variable in our condition. So we've made our code just a little bit more efficient by doing it this way. The for loop is a loop that can execute not at all. For example, if we get rid of all of the elements in our names array, we end up with an array with no elements, so it's empty. So let's look at what would happen if we try to execute this for loop. Well, first, the initialization is done, so the counter is initialized with the value of 0. The len variable is also initialized with 0 because the length property is returning 0 because there's nothing within this array. So then the condition is evaluated. 0 is less than 0. Well, that's false. So the code inside of the loop never executes. It automatically exits because the condition is false. So anything that we have outside of the loop would then execute. So let's say this is outside of the loop. And if we go to the browser, then we won't see anything except this is outside of the loop. So the for loop has the ability to not execute whatsoever if the condition is false from the very first iteration. The next loop we'll look at is the while loop. It begins with the while keyword, and it iterates while a condition is true. And the condition is inside of a set of parentheses. And then we have curly braces that we put the code in that will be repeated. Now, as this code is currently written, we would be in what's called an infinite loop. the loop never ends because the condition is always true. This is one of the downsides with a loop. If you're not careful, you can find yourself within an infinite loop. And it's not just the while loop. If we look at the for loop, it would be very easy to get stuck in an infinite loop if we simply increment by 0, therefore not incrementing at all. So I would stay at the value of 0, and we would forever be looping. And, well, right now we wouldn't be because we don't have any names, but if we had names inside of the names array, we would be stuck on the first element of the names array. So whenever you are writing loops, be careful. Look at your logic and make sure that you're not going to get stuck inside of an infinite loop. Okay, so getting back to while, we have while, then following that, the condition, and then the code for the loop to execute. Well, let's change our condition. First, let's add our values back to the names array, and let's say that while names.length is greater than 0. So what this loop is going to do is actually remove an element from the names array one at a time until we get to 0. Now remember, in the for loop we wanted to store the length property in a variable and then use that variable. Well, in this particular case we don't want to, because we want to get a new length value for every iteration of this code. And so to remove an element from the names array, we are going to use a method that we didn't look at, but it's called pop. And if you'll remember, we used the push method to add an element to the end of the array. Well, the pop element removes the last element of that array. So whenever the loop first iterates, it's going to remove Jackie, and then it's going to remove Jennifer, and then it's going to remove Jeffrey, and then it's going to remove Jeremy. And it's going to do that until length is not greater than 0. So the pop method actually returns the element that we just removed. So let's call this element, and then let's alert element, just so that we can see this in use. So if we refresh, we will see Jackie, and then Jennifer, and then Jeffrey, and then Jeremy, and then now we are outside of the loop because we eventually removed all of the elements within the array, and the loop exited because the condition was false, and then we executed the code on line 9. So like the for loop, the while loop can also not iterate at all because, or not execute at all, because of the condition. If we start off with an empty array, then the condition is automatically going to be false because length is 0, and length can, or 0 cannot be greater than 0. So we will just see the code on line 9 execute. And there you go, this is outside of the loop. But there will be times when you want a loop to iterate at least once, and we actually have a loop that does that for us. It's a lot like the while loop, but it's called do while. So we begin the do while loop using the do keyword, and then we have our loop body, so we have the curly braces, and then the code that we want to use within our loop, and then we have the while, followed by the condition. So whatever is inside of the do portion of the loop is going to execute first, and then the condition will be evaluated. So in this code that we have written, we are going to call the pop method and assign that value to the element variable. Well, as it is right now, we don't have any values or any elements within the names array, so it's going to return the value undefined, and then we will alert undefined, and then the loop will exit because names.length is 0, and 0 is not greater than 0. So we will see undefined alerted first, and then we will see this is outside of the loop. So if we go back, we will see undefined, there we go, and this is outside of the loop. So if you're going to use a do while loop, you do need to make sure that the code in the do portion is not going to fail, because it is going to execute at least once. And with that, we will call this lesson done. We covered 3 of the loops in JavaScript. There's actually another one called for in, but it is very slow. and we typically only use that in more advanced situations. So that's beyond the scope of this course, so we are just going to stick with the for, the while, and the do while loops. Well, in the next lesson, we are not going to look at the JavaScript language as much as we have over the last lessons. We are going to start looking at how we can use JavaScript in the browser by starting with the window object. So I hope you're looking forward to that, because now the really cool stuff begins. So have a good one. I'll see you next time.